He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but within minutes, he would realize he had just insulted the wrong woman. The dining room of L'Oran Prime glowed under warm amber lights, crystal glasses catching reflections as waiters moved with quiet precision across polished marble floors, and at the center of it all stood Chef Victor L'Oran, a man whose name alone carried weight in the culinary world, his white jacket immaculate, his posture sharp with authority, his voice the kind that didn't need to rise to command attention. And tonight was no different as he entertained a table of elite guests seated just feet from the open kitchen, their laughter soft but indulgent, their expectations high, because dining here wasn't just about food. It was about status, about being seen, about belonging to a world most people only dreamed of entering. And then she walked in, almost unnoticed at first, Emily Carter, wearing a simple navy cardigan and worn jeans, her shoes practical, her presence quiet, like someone who had stepped into the wrong place by accident. And for a moment, no one paid her any real attention, not until she approached the host's stand and asked a simple question, her voice calm, almost too calm, and that was when the subtle shift began. The host hesitated, eyes scanning her appearance, measuring her against the unspoken standards of the room, and within seconds, the discomfort spread, a quiet ripple of judgment that didn't need words to be understood, until Victor himself noticed, his gaze sharp, curious at first, then narrowing with something closer to amusement as he stepped forward, wiping his hands slowly on a crisp towel. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone already carried the answer. And Emily met his eyes, steady, unshaken. "I was hoping to speak with the chef," she said, and a few nearby diners exchanged glances, subtle smirks forming, because everyone in that room knew who the chef was, and more importantly, who belonged there, and who didn't. And Victor let out a quiet chuckle, not loud, but deliberate enough to be heard. "You're speaking to him," he replied, tilting his head slightly as if studying something mildly entertaining. "And what exactly do you need?" And there it was, the invitation, the moment that would either push her out or pull her into something far bigger, and Emily didn't flinch, didn't shrink. She simply reached into her worn bag and placed a small container on the counter, the kind of container no one in that room would ever associate with fine dining. And for a brief second, the room seemed to pause, curiosity mixing with quiet ridicule, and Victor's lips curved into a sharper smile. "You brought food here," he said, the disbelief almost theatrical now. And somewhere behind him, a soft laugh broke through, followed by another, until the tension shifted into something heavier, something public, something that turned her presence into a spectacle. And Victor leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal, yet loud enough for those closest to hear. "This kitchen doesn't need help," he said, his eyes flicking to the container and back to her face. "Especially not from someone who doesn't understand what we do here." And still, Emily didn't respond the way they expected. No apology, no retreat, just a quiet stillness, as if she were waiting, not for permission, but for something else entirely. And in that moment, no one realized the night had already begun to shift, because the biggest mistake in that room had just been made. And it wasn't hers. The laughter did not fade. It spread, subtle at first, then louder as the guests leaned into the moment, forks pausing midair, wine glasses hovering as curiosity turned into quiet entertainment, because in a place like this, humiliation was just another course if it was served with confidence. And Victor L'Oran knew exactly how to serve it. He straightened his jacket, glancing briefly at the nearest table where a man in a tailored suit smirked openly. And that was all the encouragement he needed. "Tell me," Victor said, his voice now carrying just enough volume to reach beyond the counter. "Did you get lost on your way to a home kitchen?" A few chuckles followed, sharper this time, more certain, and Emily stood there, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, her expression unchanged, not defensive, not embarrassed, just still. And that stillness made something shift again, almost imperceptibly, but Victor ignored it, stepping around the counter with slow, deliberate confidence, closing the distance between them, as if inspecting something beneath his standards. "People come here for precision," he continued, gesturing toward the gleaming stainless steel, the controlled chaos of chefs moving in perfect rhythm. Behind him, for discipline, For years of training you cannot buy in a grocery store. His eyes dropped briefly to the container she had placed down, then back to her face. Not for whatever that is. And someone near the bar let out a quiet laugh, quickly stifled, because even mockery had rules in a room like this. But the energy had already shifted. It was no longer about whether she belonged. It was about how far he would take it. And Victor, fueled by the attention, leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice again, but not enough to keep it private. You see, cooking is not a hobby here, he said. It is earned. And for the first time, a faint reaction flickered across Emily's face. Not anger, not shame. Something quieter, something that did not match the tone of the room. Her eyes moved briefly across the kitchen, not with uncertainty, but with recognition, as if she were reading it, understanding it in a way no one else noticed. And then she spoke, her voice calm, steady, almost soft enough to be missed if the room had not grown so strangely attentive. Then you should taste it, she said, and the words landed differently than expected, not defensive, not pleading, just a statement, simple and direct, and Victor paused, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause most people would miss. But in that silence, something tightened in the air, because confidence like that did not usually come from someone who did not belong, and yet the room was already committed to the narrative. A guest near the front leaned forward, smiling as if watching a show unfold. Another lifted a phone just slightly, capturing the moment, and Victor's expression shifted again, this time sharper, more deliberate, because now it was no longer just amusement, it was a challenge, and challenges in his kitchen were not taken lightly. He straightened fully, glancing back at his staff who had slowed almost imperceptibly, their movements less fluid now as their attention drifted toward the exchange. You want me to taste it? He repeated, louder now, letting the words carry, letting the room hear the absurdity, the audacity, and a few heads nodded, eager, entertained, waiting for the inevitable outcome, and Victor smiled. But this time there was something colder in it, something more calculated. Fine, he said, stepping back toward the counter and gesturing toward the kitchen behind him. But if we are doing this, we do it properly. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would confirm what everyone else already believed. And he found none, not a flicker, not a breath out of place. And that was the moment the room shifted again, quieter now, heavier, because what had started as a joke was beginning to feel like something else, something no one had planned for. And, without realizing it, Victor Laurent had just given her exactly what she needed the moment he stepped aside and opened his kitchen to her. The energy in the room shifted from amusement to anticipation, because now there was something at stake, something unspoken but understood, and every eye followed Emily Carter as she moved forward, not hesitating, not rushing, just walking with a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone out of place. And as she crossed the threshold into the kitchen, the polished steel surfaces reflected her simple silhouette in sharp contrast to the pristine uniforms around her, a visual that should have looked wrong but somehow did not, and the chefs paused, their movements slowing as they watched her, curiosity replacing the earlier indifference, because there was something about the way she entered that space, something measured, something familiar, as if she had done it before, many times, in rooms just like this, and Victor noticed it too, though he did not acknowledge it, instead gesturing toward an empty station with a casual flick of his hand. You will need more than that container, he said, his tone still edged with control, but no longer careless, and Emily nodded slightly, setting her container down before glancing across the ingredients laid out around her. Herbs, cuts of meat, sauces prepared with precision, everything arranged with intention, and for a brief second, her fingers hovered above the counter, not unsure, but selecting, evaluating, like someone reading a language others did not fully understand. And then she began, not with flourish, not with dramatic gestures, but with a quiet efficiency that immediately altered the rhythm of the kitchen. Her movements were smooth, economical, no wasted motion, no hesitation, and the sound changed. The steady hum of conversation from the dining room faded into the background as the subtle cadence of her work took over, the clean slice of a knife against a cutting board, the controlled hiss of heat meeting butter, the soft clink of utensils placed exactly where they needed to be, and one of the line cooks glanced at another, a silent exchange passing between them, Because this was not what they expected. This was not amateur curiosity or reckless improvisation. This was discipline, refined and practiced, and Victor crossed his arms, watching more closely now, his expression tightening not with anger, but with focus, as if he were trying to identify something just out of reach. And Emily remained silent, her attention fully absorbed in what she was doing, the room no longer existing beyond the small space in front of her, and time stretched, not long, but enough for the shift to become undeniable. The laughter from earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet tension that settled over the dining room like a held breath. And even the guests who had been so eager for entertainment now leaned forward differently, their expressions less amused, more intent, as if they were witnessing something they did not yet understand. And Victor stepped closer, just slightly, enough to see the details, the precision in her cuts, the restraint in her seasoning, the way she adjusted the heat without looking. And that was when something inside him flickered, not recognition yet, but the beginning of it, a faint echo of something he had seen before, somewhere else, in a kitchen far removed from this one. And for the first time that night, he did not speak, he simply watched, because whatever was happening in front of him, it was no longer a joke, and deep down, he was starting to realize that he had already lost control of the narrative by the time the first layer of aroma began to rise from the pan. Something unspoken settled over the entire room. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried weight, the kind of shift that made people stop mid-sentence without realizing why. And in the dining room, forks hovered again. Conversations faded into low murmurs, because what they were witnessing no longer felt like entertainment. It felt like something unfolding, something precise. And inside the kitchen, Emily's movements remained calm, almost quiet in their confidence. She adjusted the flame with a slight turn of her wrist, not looking down, not second guessing, and the butter browned just to the edge of perfection, releasing a deep, nutty aroma that did not belong to something careless. And one of the sous chefs leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in recognition, because that level of control was not learned casually. It was earned through repetition, through years that could not be seen at a glance. And Victor noticed that reaction, his gaze shifting briefly from Emily to his staff, reading their expressions, measuring the subtle change in their posture. And something in his chest tightened, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when certainty begins to crack. And he stepped closer again, now standing just behind her shoulder, close enough to see every detail, the angle of her knife, the timing of her movements, the way she layered ingredients with restraint instead of excess. And that restraint was what unsettled him the most. Because amateurs tried to impress, they added more, chased attention. But this was different. This was someone who understood that power came from knowing when to stop. And the pan sizzled softly as she finished a final adjustment, her hand steady, her focus absolute. And then, without announcing it, without looking up, she began to plate. And that was when the room seemed to lean in all at once, because plating was where intent became visible, where everything hidden in the process revealed itself in a single glance. And Emily did not rush. She placed each element with care, not decorative, not excessive, just enough, just balanced. And when she stepped back, the dish sat there quietly, almost understated against the polished counter. And for a moment, no one spoke, not the guests, not the staff, not even Victor, because it did not look like a performance. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, confident in what it was. And Victor stared at it, his expression unreadable now, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by something far more focused. And slowly, deliberately, he reached for a fork, the movement controlled, measured, as if the act itself carried more weight than it should. And the room followed that motion, every eye fixed on the small piece he lifted, because now there was no laughter left, no mockery to hide behind, only expectation. And as he brought the fork closer, something in his posture shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a man stepping into something he could not yet define. And just before the taste, just before the moment that would decide everything, there was a silence so complete it felt almost intentional, like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something it did not fully understand, but could no longer ignore. The fork paused just inches from his lips, and for a fraction of a second, Victor Laurent hesitated, not visibly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for something inside him to shift, because instinct, the same instinct that had built his reputation, was whispering something unfamiliar, something inconvenient, and yet the room was watching, waiting, expecting a reaction that matched the narrative he had created. So he followed through, placing the bite in his mouth with controlled precision, his posture still composed, his expression neutral, and at first, nothing changed. His jaw moved once, slowly, deliberately, as if analyzing, breaking down the components. And then it happened, subtle but undeniable. His eyes flickered, just slightly, and the movement was so small that only those closest could see it. But it was enough, because that flicker carried something far more powerful than words. It carried recognition, and in that instant, the room felt it. Even if they could not explain it, the silence deepened, sharpened, stretching into something almost electric. And Victor stopped chewing, not dramatically, not abruptly. Just stopped, his gaze lowering to the plate in front of him as if it held an answer he had not expected to find. And memory began to surface. Not clearly, not fully formed, but enough to disrupt the certainty he had been standing on all evening. Flavors layered with intention, restraint that spoke louder than complexity, a balance that could not be faked, could not be improvised. And his hand, still holding the fork, tightened ever so slightly, because this was not coincidence, this was not luck, this was skill, refined, deliberate, undeniable. And for the first time since she had entered his kitchen, Victor Laurent did not have control of the moment. He had become part of it. And around him, the room remained frozen, guests leaning forward without realizing it, staff standing still in positions they had not meant to hold, because everyone was waiting for him, for his reaction, for confirmation of what they were beginning to suspect. And yet he did not speak, not immediately, because words would require certainty, and certainty was no longer something he possessed. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted his gaze from the plate to Emily, really looking at her now, not as an interruption, not as a mistake, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit the image he had assigned to her. And in her expression, he found nothing, no pride, no anticipation, no need for validation, just quiet stillness, the same stillness she had carried from the moment she walked in. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because people who needed to prove something always showed it, but she did not, and that meant she already knew. And the realization landed heavier than the taste itself, and a murmur began to ripple through the dining room, soft, uncertain, as if the audience was trying to recalibrate what they were witnessing, because the outcome they expected was no longer unfolding. And Victor placed the fork down carefully, not rushed, not careless, just deliberate. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" And the question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as something else entirely, something closer to respect. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, because the man who had once controlled the narrative was now asking for answers. And Emily Carter, the woman no one had taken seriously, stood there quietly, holding them all in a silence they could not break. The question did not demand an answer. It invited one. And that alone changed everything. Because moments earlier, Chef Victor Laurent had spoken from a place of authority, but now there was something else beneath his words, something quieter, something that did not belong to a man who was certain of himself. And the room felt it immediately, the subtle shift from dominance to curiosity, from control to uncertainty. And all eyes turned to Emily Carter, waiting, not for defense, not for explanation, but for something that would make sense of what had just happened. And she stood there exactly as she had before, calm, composed, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, as if nothing in the room had changed, even though everything had. And for a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle, just long enough for the weight of his question to land fully. And then she answered, her voice soft, steady, almost conversational. "I learned a long time ago," she said. And the simplicity of it caught people off guard, because it did not match the intensity of the moment. It did not offer details. It did not seek validation. It simply existed, and Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in focus, Because he understood something most in the room did not, that answers like that were never accidental. They were intentional, and behind them was always more. And he took a small step closer, lowering his voice again, though now it carried no trace of mockery, only intent. "That is not something you learn at home," he said, his gaze fixed on her hands, the way they rested without tension, without the subtle tremor of someone performing under pressure. "That is trained." And Emily's eyes flickered, just briefly, not away, but inward, as if something had been acknowledged without being spoken, and the room leaned in again, the silence now heavier, more deliberate, because what had started as a spectacle had transformed into something far more intimate, something that no longer belonged to the audience. And one of the guests at the front table shifted in his seat, lowering his glass slowly, his earlier amusement replaced by quiet attention, and in the kitchen, the staff stood still, not out of obligation, but because they could not look away, because they were watching something they did not fully understand but instinctively respected. And Victor studied her for another moment, searching, connecting, because the taste still lingered, not just on his palate, but in his memory, and slowly, almost cautiously, he reached for the fork again, taking another bite, this time not for confirmation, but for understanding, and the reaction was different, not sharper, but deeper, because now he was looking for it, the structure, the discipline, the signature hidden within restraint. And when he set the fork down again, his expression had changed completely, the certainty of earlier replaced by something far more unsettling, recognition without clarity, familiarity without context. And he exhaled quietly, almost to himself. "I have tasted this before," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. And that was when the room shifted once more, not with laughter, not with disbelief, but with realization, because whatever had just happened, it was no longer about proving a point. It was about uncovering something that had been hidden in plain sight. And Emily did not react, did not confirm or deny. She simply stood there, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had been here all along, waiting for the moment when someone would finally see what had always been there. And in that silence, something became undeniable. This was no longer a question of whether she belonged. It was a question of why no one had recognized it sooner. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. "I have tasted this before." And they did not sound like a conclusion. They sounded like the beginning of something Victor Laurent was not prepared to confront, because recognition without context is unsettling. It demands answers that pride does not easily allow, and the room could feel that tension, subtle but undeniable, as if something invisible had shifted its weight across the space. And Emily Carter stood in the center of it, unchanged, unaffected, her presence steady while everything around her adjusted, recalibrated. And Victor's mind moved quickly now, faster than his composed exterior revealed, searching through years of experience, through kitchens across cities, through plates that had defined his career, trying to locate that exact balance, that signature hidden beneath simplicity, because this was not imitation, it was not influence, it was something original, something precise, and yet undeniably familiar. And that contradiction unsettled him more than anything else. And he took another step closer, no longer performing for the room, no longer speaking for the audience, but for himself. "This technique," he said quietly, almost to himself, "this restraint, this control." And he stopped, because saying it out loud made it real, made it harder to ignore. And one of the sous chefs shifted behind him, exchanging a glance with another, because they heard it too, the change in his voice, the absence of authority, replaced by something closer to respect. And that alone was enough to silence the last remnants of disbelief in the room. And a guest at the far table leaned forward, setting his glass down slowly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Because what had begun as entertainment had transformed into something else entirely, something that demanded attention. And Emily finally moved, not dramatically, not to reclaim the space, but simply to adjust the edge of the plate, a small motion, almost unnecessary, but executed with the same quiet precision as everything else she had done. And Victor's eyes followed that movement instinctively, because details mattered, they always had. And in that detail, in that small correction, something clicked, not fully, not completely, but enough to shift the direction of his thoughts. And his gaze lifted back to her face, searching now not for answers, but for confirmation, and he asked again, this time without the distance he had maintained before, "Who taught you?" And the question carried weight, not because of its words, but because of what it implied. That skill like this did not appear by chance. It came from somewhere, from someone, from a history that left marks even when it was hidden. And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm. But this time there was something else there, something deeper, not pride, not defiance, but memory. And she took a small breath, not because she needed it, but because the moment required it. And then she answered, "Someone who believed food should speak before the chef ever does." And the words landed softly, but they carried more weight than anything said that night, because in them was philosophy, identity, and something else Victor recognized immediately, something he had not heard in years but had never forgotten. And his posture shifted again, more noticeably this time, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the rigid edge of control fading into something more human, more uncertain. And the room felt it, the subtle collapse of the narrative that had defined the night, because now the question was no longer whether she belonged, it was who she truly was, and why her presence felt like something that had been missing all along. The sentence settled into the room, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. Someone who believed food should speak before the chef ever does. And for Victor Laurent, those words did not just sound familiar, they felt personal, like a memory brushing against the edge of recognition. And his gaze sharpened, not with judgment, but with something closer to realization, because philosophies like that were not common. They were not taught in culinary schools or written in cookbooks. They were passed down, shaped in kitchens where discipline was not performed but lived. And for the first time that night, Victor did not look at Emily as an outsider stepping into his world. He looked at her as someone who might have once stood in a world he had known, and that thought alone shifted something deeper inside him. And the room felt it, the subtle gravity of a moment turning inward, away from spectacle and into something far more revealing. And one of the senior chefs in the back straightened slightly, his expression changing as well, because he too recognized the weight behind those words, even if he could not place them. And Victor's voice, when he spoke again, was quieter than it had ever been, stripped of performance entirely. "That is not something you forget," he said, almost more to himself than to her. And Emily held his gaze, not challenging, not confirming, just present. And that presence carried more truth than any explanation could have. And the silence stretched again. But this time it was not tense, it was heavy with understanding, the kind that builds when pieces begin to align without being forced. And Victor's eyes moved briefly to the dish again, then back to her, as if trying to reconcile what he saw with what he remembered. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he spoke again. "There was only one person I knew who said that." And the words came carefully, measured, because saying them out loud made the connection harder to deny. And a faint shift passed through the room, not audible, but felt, as if everyone present understood that something significant was unfolding, even if they did not know what it was. And Emily's expression softened, just slightly, not enough to reveal everything, but enough to confirm something had been acknowledged. And Victor took a small step back, not retreating, but recalibrating, because the certainty he had carried all evening had now been replaced by something far more complex, something that demanded humility. And he let out a quiet breath, his posture no longer rigid, his authority no longer the center of the room. And for the first time since she had entered, the space felt balanced, not controlled by one voice, but shared between two. And in that balance, the truth began to take shape, not through declaration, but through recognition. And the guests, the staff, everyone watching, could feel it building, the sense that the story they thought they were witnessing was not the real one at all, and that the woman they had dismissed so easily was standing at the center of something far more important than any of them had realized. And Victor, standing there with the weight of that realization settling in, understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever came next would not just change the moment, it would change how he saw. Everything that had led to it. The air in the room had changed completely, no longer filled with quiet judgment or curiosity, but with something heavier, something closer to anticipation, as if everyone present understood they were standing on the edge of a truth that had not yet been spoken. And Victor Laurent felt it more than anyone, because the pieces in his mind were no longer scattered. They were aligning, slowly, inevitably. And he looked at Emily again, not searching now, but confirming. Because there was a memory rising, one he had not revisited in years, a kitchen far smaller than this one. No marble, no audience, just heat, discipline, and a voice that never raised itself yet commanded everything in the room. And his jaw tightened slightly as that memory sharpened, because that voice had said those exact words, not once, but many times, always the same, always with purpose, and he took a slow breath, his eyes narrowing just enough to hold onto the thought. There was a chef, he said, his voice quieter now, more careful. Someone who trained only a handful of people. Someone who believed simplicity was the hardest thing to achieve. And the moment he said it, a subtle ripple moved through the kitchen staff, because even if they did not know the name, they recognized the weight behind the description, and Emily did not interrupt, did not rush to fill the silence. She simply stood there, allowing him to reach the conclusion on his own, and that was when it happened. The realization that had been building finally surfaced, not as a sudden shock, but as something undeniable, something that could no longer be ignored, and Victor's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for those closest to see it, the loss of certainty, the emergence of something far more human, and he stepped back slightly, not retreating, but creating space, as if he needed distance to fully see what was in front of him, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried something it had not before, something quieter, almost careful. You did not just learn this, he said, his gaze steady now, fixed on her. You were trained in it. And the statement landed differently than anything else he had said that night, because it was no longer dismissive, no longer challenging. It was an acknowledgement, and the room absorbed it. Instantly, the shift from disbelief to understanding becoming complete, and a guest near the front exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension they had not realized they were holding. While one of the chefs behind Victor straightened fully, his earlier uncertainty replaced by respect, because now it was clear, whatever they had witnessed was not chance, it was mastery, hidden, restrained, and deliberately unseen until now. And Emily finally moved again, not to step forward, not to claim anything, but simply to lift her eyes to meet his fully. And in that moment, there was no imbalance between them, no hierarchy, no audience. Just two people standing in the truth of what had been revealed, and she spoke, her voice as steady as it had always been. I was taught to let the food speak, she said, and the words did not confirm everything, but they confirmed enough. Enough for Victor to understand that the answer he was looking for was already there, not in what she said, but in everything she had done, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the realization that the woman they had all dismissed had never needed to prove anything at all, because she had already been everything they failed to see. The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled into Victor Laurent slowly, like something he had been avoiding but could no longer ignore, and as he stood there in his own kitchen, surrounded by polished steel and silent staff, he felt the weight of it pressing in from every direction, because this was no longer about a dish, no longer about a moment. It was about something far deeper, something tied to identity, to memory, to a standard he had once held above everything else. And his eyes remained fixed on Emily Carter, not with doubt now, but with a kind of clarity that stripped away everything unnecessary. And he spoke again, his voice quieter than it had ever been that night. There are not many people who cook like this, he said, and the words were not meant for the room. They were meant for himself. A confirmation spoken out loud, and the kitchen remained still, every member of his staff aware that something irreversible was unfolding, and Victor took a slow breath, the kind that carried intention, as if preparing to step into something he could not walk back from. The chef I trained under, he continued, his tone steady but no longer commanding. He believed that mastery was not in complexity, but in knowing exactly what to leave out. And the moment he said it, the connection solidified, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, and his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the change, the subtle lowering of his shoulders, the release of something he had been holding onto since the moment she walked in, and he looked at her again, fully now, without the filter of assumption, without the barrier of status, and what he saw was not someone out of place. It was someone who had never needed to belong to his world in the first place, because she had always been part of something greater than it, and the room felt it, the complete reversal of everything that had been established. Because now the power did not sit with the man who owned the kitchen, it rested with the woman who had quietly stepped into it and changed everything without raising her voice. And one of the guests near the front leaned back slightly, exhaling under his breath, as if trying to process the shift, while another lowered their phone, no longer interested in capturing a spectacle, but witnessing something real. And Victor's voice, when he spoke again, carried a weight that had not been there before, not authority, not performance, but acknowledgement. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question was no longer rhetorical, no longer part of a challenge. It was genuine, direct, and it echoed through the room with a clarity that silenced everything else. And Emily held his gaze, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself paused, waiting for her answer, because whatever she said next would not just define her, it would redefine everything that had happened in that room. And in that silence, one thing became undeniable. The night no longer belonged to the chef. It belonged to the truth he had just uncovered, and he knew, without needing to say it, that whatever came next would leave a mark far beyond this single moment, far beyond this single dish, because respect, once awakened, does not fade quietly. The question lingered in the air. "Who are you?" And for the first time, that night, it carried no edge, no challenge, only quiet honesty, the kind that stripped everything else away. And the room held still, as if even the smallest sound might break something fragile that had just formed. And Emily Carter did not rush to answer. She did not step forward to claim the moment. She simply stood there, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had never needed recognition to define her. And Victor Laurent watched her closely, not with impatience, but with something deeper, something that resembled respect, because he understood now that whatever answer she gave would not be simple. It would not be loud. It would not be designed to impress. It would simply be true, and that truth carried more weight than anything else in the room. And finally, she spoke, her voice calm, unshaken. "I am someone who was taught to listen before I ever learned to speak." And the words settled softly, but they changed everything, because they were not just an answer, they were a reflection of everything he had just witnessed, every movement, every choice, every moment of restraint that had defined her presence in his kitchen. And Victor's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal understanding, because he recognized that philosophy, not as a concept, but as something he had once lived by, something he had slowly drifted away from without realizing it. And the realization carried weight, heavier than the earlier embarrassment, heavier than the shift in power, because it was not just about her skill, it was about what her presence represented. And around them, the room remained silent, but it was no longer tense, it was reflective, as if everyone present was processing something beyond the surface of what they had seen. And one of the chefs in the back lowered his gaze slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of acknowledgement, because the hierarchy that had once defined the space no longer felt absolute. And Victor took a slow step back, not retreating, but creating space, the same space he had once filled with authority, now allowing something else to exist within it. And he nodded once, small but deliberate, the kind of gesture that did not need to be announced to be understood. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but stripped of everything unnecessary. "Then I misjudged you," he said. And the admission was simple, but it carried more weight than any apology could have, because it was not offered to repair the moment. It was offered to acknowledge the truth of it. And Emily did not respond with satisfaction, did not claim victory. She simply met his gaze with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, because for her, this had never been about proving anything. And that was what made it undeniable. And in that moment, the room understood something that could not be taught, that dignity does not demand recognition. It reveals itself when everything else falls away. And Victor Laurent, standing in the center of his own kitchen, realized that the lesson he had just witnessed was not about cooking at all. It was about something far more lasting, something he would not forget again. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. "Then I misjudged you." And they did not feel like the end of something, but the beginning of a quiet reckoning that extended far beyond the kitchen walls. Because in a place built on precision and reputation, an admission like that carried weight, not just for the man who spoke it, but for everyone who had witnessed the moment unfold, and the room absorbed it slowly. The silence no longer sharp or tense, but reflective, almost reverent, as if something important had just been placed before them and no one wanted to disturb it. And Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been from the start, composed, grounded, untouched by the shift that had just redefined the space around her. And Victor Laurent studied her again, but now there was no trace of judgment left in his gaze, only clarity, the kind that comes after something has been stripped down to its truth. And he exhaled quietly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because what he had just experienced was not just a challenge to his authority, it was a reminder of something he had once understood but had allowed to fade. And he turned slightly, his eyes moving across his kitchen, across the staff who now stood differently than before, their posture no longer rigid with expectation, but softened with awareness. And he realized that the lesson unfolding was not his alone. It belonged to everyone present, and without raising his voice, without reclaiming control, he spoke again. "What you did here tonight," he said, his tone steady, measured. "It was not about proving anything." And he paused, not because he was unsure, but because the words needed to land, needed to be understood. It was about reminding us what this is supposed to be. And the statement carried through the room with quiet authority, not imposed, but earned. And a subtle shift moved through the guests as well, the earlier distance between observer and participant dissolving into something more personal, because now they were no longer watching a performance. They were part of a realization, and Emily's eyes moved briefly across the space, not claiming it, not owning it, but acknowledging it, as if she understood that what had happened here would stay with them long after the moment passed. And Victor took a step back, creating space once more, not as a gesture of control, but of respect, and he nodded again, slightly deeper this time. A silent acknowledgement that required no further explanation, and in that gesture, the entire room seemed to settle, the tension fully replaced by something quieter, something lasting, and no one spoke, not immediately, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been understood. And in that stillness, the lesson revealed itself without force, without demand, simply existing in the space between them. That mastery does not need recognition to be real, and dignity does not need permission to be seen. And for the first time that night, the kitchen did not belong to status or reputation. It belonged to truth, and everyone present knew, without needing to say it, that they had just witnessed something they would not forget. The silence did not break. It settled, deeper than before, like something final had been placed in the room and no one dared disturb it. And for a long moment, no one moved, not the guests, not the staff, not even Victor Laurent, because what had just unfolded was no longer a moment to react to. It was something to absorb, something that demanded stillness, and Emily Carter stood at the center of it all, exactly as she had been from the beginning, unchanged by the shift in perception, untouched by the weight of recognition, as if none of it had ever been necessary for her to understand her own worth. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she reached for the container she had brought with her, the same simple object that had first drawn quiet judgment from the room, and she closed it with a soft, deliberate motion, not rushed, not symbolic, just complete. And that small action carried more meaning than anything else that night, because it marked the end of something without needing to announce it. And Victor watched her, not with authority, not with control, but with a kind of respect that did not seek to interrupt, because he understood now that this moment did not belong to him. It never had. And as she lifted the container, preparing to leave the space as quietly as she had entered it, one of the younger chefs took an unconscious step forward, as if about to speak, but stopped himself, because there was nothing that needed to be said. And Emily turned slightly, her gaze moving once across the kitchen, not lingering, not claiming, just acknowledging. And then she spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach everyone without effort. "It was never about being seen," she said, and the words landed gently, but they stayed, echoing in a way that no louder statement ever could. It was about doing it right. And with that, she stepped away from the counter, her movements as measured as they had been from the start, and the room watched her go, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with something else entirely, something quieter, something that felt closer to understanding. And Victor remained where he stood, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer commanding the room, but part of it. And as the door closed softly behind her, the sound seemed to carry through the space like a final note, and no one spoke, because there was nothing left to fill. And after a long moment, Victor looked down at the plate once more, not analyzing, not questioning, just seeing it for what it was, and he let out a slow breath, the kind that carried acceptance, because the lesson had already been given, and it did not require repetition. And around him, the kitchen began to move again, slowly at first, then returning to rhythm. But something had changed, something that would not return to what it had been before. And that night, long after the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, the memory of that quiet woman and the dish that silenced an entire room remained, not as a story to tell, but as a standard to remember. And in that memory, one truth stayed clear, that dignity does not arrive with recognition. It reveals itself in the moments when no one expects it, and those who truly understand it never need to announce it at all.